Joe, I knew this was a bad week to not pick up my dry cleaning, because now I don't have any of my Starfleet apparel.
I say, Mark, this is not the first episode of Star Trek stuff we've covered that you have once again failed to dress for the occasion for.
I'm wearing like medical, teal, kind of, right?
I mean, yeah, true. It's close enough. We can say that those are like the Voyager teal underoos.
Yeah, there you go.
Which, for what we're talking about this week, is appropriate as we do have quite the uniform change-up with Starfleet in what we're talking about this week. So to go ahead and instead of leaving you all hanging, this week we're talking about the 1994 movie Star Trek Generations, which would be the first in the Next Generation cast worth of movies, and also bring a close to the original series movies simultaneously. And among many things that happen in this movie is a bit of a wardrobe crisis, as the crew is constantly changing what they're wearing throughout the movie.
I will overlook that for just a moment, because for me, I'm trying to look back on this and not think about it in terms of what like an MCU level event is now, right? But when I look at this, I wasn't like a huge, like Trekkie person back in 94. Like my brothers were. I had watched a little bit of like OG with my dad and everything, but I don't know if I really truly appreciated this combination of generations of the shows. And God, 94, like holy shit, Joe, we're almost celebrating 30 years of this movie already.
Oh my God, don't remind me. Especially when we get to like the main theme of this movie, like it really, really hits home when you start bringing up the age of things.
Yeah. Yeah. It's literally meant to be a handoff from the original crew to the TNG crew, which is what TNG was supposed to be anyway. But they're 80 years apart, so it's a little hard to physically do that. Or excuse me, 78 years apart. Sorry, I don't want to upset anybody there.
I mean, we have one captain who was saving the galaxy while another captain's grandfather was in diapers. Through the original series to Next Generation. So this movie was meant to be oddly enough, the spiritual like passing of the torch, despite the fact that Star Trek Next Generation had already ended by this time. That series itself had wrapped up.
Which is crazy to think that this movie is recording like 4 days after the TV show's over. And it takes 6 months to make. That's a ridiculous turnaround.
Yeah, I would, especially since given like, the series ends in like a spectacular two-part actually, no, I'm trying to remember I don't think they aired in two parts. I think it was just basically a two-part episode aired all at once. I remember being a very, very big deal when it was done. Like, I do remember like staying up late and watching a lot of Star Trek, as well as watching it when it was actually brand new for Next Gen. And I do remember specifically like my family, like without even me or my brother having to prompt them, to bust out the camcorder, hook it up to the VCR, and record the last episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, because it was a big deal that it was finally coming to an end after 7 seasons.
It's true. I mean, yeah, we didn't have any recording capabilities on demand. We're still using dial-up. So yeah, it was actually not even using dial-up yet, maybe like around the cusp. But this was cool to kind of look back on initially. And I'm not talking about for this episode or for this podcast. I just mean in general, looking back on this, because when it came out, we weren't going to the movies for everything, right? And to convince my mom, hey, can you take the boys to Star Trek? And that wasn't a move that my mom was willing to commit to. But what I am interested in what they committed to here was they brought David Carson back, one of the directors from the actual TV show. So he had his hand in directing a couple of the episodes. And then they slap John A. Alonzo, who is the cinematographer from fucking Scarface.
As I say, they do give Next Gen some sexy PG-13 lighting this time around, now that we've hit the big screen.
Surprisingly, dude, the way that these scenes kind of move, they do look really good. I mean, especially as we start to explore some of the surface levels of planets and stuff, like you're actually getting some pretty solid, like, just programming there. I mean, I will give them that. But what I don't want to give them is necessarily too much of my opinion just yet. I would rather ask, did people hate this movie?
Yes. It turns out people really didn't like this movie. And I mean, trying to think, like, in like the scope of things, like, where did this end up in terms of Star Trek movies? Because Star Trek, unlike Star Wars, where we had like a solid like opening three that everyone loved and cherished, and then kind of like, a dud for four, and then the next one was okay, then it got better, then it got bad again, and there's no real rhyme or reason. It seems like Star Trek, every other movie is the good one. The motion picture, lame. Wrath of Khan, fantastic. Search for Spock, not really good. Undiscovered Country, hold on, that was 5. I take that back. That's later. Yeah, that one was good. So it's, when you get to Generations, this is after, I believe it's the 7th Star Trek movie, which according to usual Star Trek math does mean it should be bad, by all accounts. So when you look at where people are on this, like Leonard Nimoy himself really didn't like this movie. He was actually kind of vocal about it, how much he didn't like this movie. Same with Bones. DeForest Kelley, also not a fan.
Yeah, dude, like Nimoy, I can just imagine he reads the script and he's like, fuck this shit, I'm out. And just boom, he's done. Now, DeForest Kelley, I just imagine that he would have been happier just smoking cigarettes and not acting again after he was done with this TV career. So he's not so much of a shock. But for Leonard Nimoy to agree to come back for the Kelvinverse and then to go, I am not going to go anywhere near this film. And then after he watched it, he just reinforced that belief that this is the worst thing I've ever seen. That's saying something.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it wasn't just him saying this, though. It has a 48% critic rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with the fans not being far behind at 57. Yeah. Like, that's usually, you're not going to find consensus a lot of times for like sci-fi between those parties, and they do on this one. What do you have to say about that, sir? Clad in your Starfleet uniform.
Well, while I'm not going to be the one to basically be, despite my attire, the Star Trek fanboy, this is something where, like, I don't agree with the critics and the fan consensus on this, but we'll get to more of that later. But I do agree with like your statement that typically when you have like a critic and a fan consensus, it is fairly rare, especially on Rotten Tomatoes. So you will have times where like you have a critic rating is very low, but the fans absolutely love it because there's a good deal of fan service. And it seems like the movie was specifically made for the fans, and the general audience probably wouldn't really enjoy it. Or sometimes it's the other way around, where the general audience would probably love it, but the fans are kind of mad that they didn't get what they're hoping out of it. Therefore, the critic rating is higher and the fans are lower. But this is one where it kind of lined up, where with only, like, what was it, 9% more of the fans liking it than, I'm sorry, 11%, 9% more liking it. So, I mean, it should, on paper, be a bad movie.
That's why I think it's important, like we've been doing with some of our movies this year so far, is actually read some of the reviews, okay?
Oh boy.
So what we've done is I've tried to find what's like a positive, a negative, and a neutral, okay? So the first one I think is actually going to be the more neutral one, which is it isn't straight up horrible since it gives some good character moments, but there's a lot of cheesy moments in dialogue, and it sends off William Shatner's character in the worst way imaginable. Now, that's a very negative sounding review.
Yeah, for a neutral comment.
But I still think that is probably the most neutral way to approach this movie. I really do. And as we get through this, we'll come back to that. Now, the positive one is a great mix between old and new generations with unexpected character development and a good finale for James T. Kirk. So we've already got warring opinions here. Now we're going to go straight into the negative.
Which, before we get there, I guess, spoiler alert, because we forgot to say it for a film that's almost 30 years old, James T. Kirk does die in this movie.
Oh, yeah.
That
yeah,
happens,
he gets bodied in this one, which we will come back to because there's some really funny stuff behind that. But the negative rating says Star Trek Generations was a misguided attempt to appease both hardcore Trekkies and casual fans of the franchise alike. Its intentions were questionable, and the choice to honor Kirk also did not really work out. Stewart is reliably nuanced as Picard, Shatner is fun as Kirk, McDowell is cool as the villain. All three worked, but their scenes together felt rushed and reduced to too many fisting brawls. Which, Joe, Star Trek usually doesn't solve problems with their fists all the time.
No, it doesn't. And I'm actually kind of wondering why that was a statement, as I can only recall like 2 scenes of fisticuffs in this movie. So,
but they're important. They're important fisticuffs. Let me tell you.
Yeah, they're important fisticuffs. There's only 2 throwdowns, as far as like physical throwdowns in this movie. So that, I mean, for a negative review, I'm not going to say it's completely unwarranted, but I mean, the last comment, I think, good sir or madam, you were digging a bit.
Which I think reading those, I read through quite a few of them, and I can't say I fault people for this. You know, like when we talked about National Treasure earlier this season on this program, we kind of pointed out how we obviously love Nicolas Cage and the ground he walks on, but there are certain elements of that movie that I don't think really worked for everyone. But the overall consensus is I'm still going to enjoy this movie, you know, even though not all of it's believable. What you're picking up on here when you read through the reviews of this, there are various different levels of people who watched it that even liked it that are coming back to this and going, I don't know if I'm okay waiting until the next therapy session to talk about this. You know, like it didn't go very well.
Yeah, there were a lot of people with the doll showing where Rick Berman hurt them with this one, which I mean would kind of continue to happen through all the next gen stuff, as Rick Berman was blamed for a lot of things. I know there was like a specific letter of anger over a same-sex kiss on DS9, and he replied with, if the viewer would have instead preferred that Jetsia like shot someone with a phaser and like completely disintegrated them, and they were just gone out of existence, if they would prefer that. And I think the fan replied, yes, I would prefer that. And then Berman pointed out, well, that seems like that's probably more of a problem than 2 women kissing. But I digress.
Yeah, this movie, for me, if you want to talk about problems or even fan sentiment, obviously the place to start with is literally the beginning, where we see some of these OG crew members walking aboard the bridge. But immediately you can tell this isn't the same vibe as like the OG stuff in the original movies. Right away, it feels like there's this filter of sadness, maybe a little bit of longing, and the actors. Let me say this: I got to give them a heads up, because on the TV show, not going to say that the strongest acting came about for the original series,
no.
and sometimes even questionable in TNG, but there's this level of interactions between, you know, when we're introduced to the OG crew again, coming back aboard a new ship, right? The little bottle going through space. We've got
our vintage 23rd century.
Yes, yes, we have a new ship going out into space, right?
Yeah.
But like we get Kirk, Chekhov, and Scotty right away. You know, we're suddenly like seeing our heroes of the past, and usually when you see heroes, the older generation in a movie, whether it's action, whether it's you know, even fantasy based, whatever, normally you see those OG crew people or those OG characters and you think about like, man, they still got it.
Yeah.
But when you see these 3, you can tell the miles were very, very high on these guys. Like
yes.
even in '94, like it wasn't all highway. Like you could just tell they're tired. These guys, they're trying to muster, you know, their energy for being back aboard, right? Because they've been retired for years at this stage.
They have been. And we should say what they are coming on board is the Enterprise B, an Excelsior class ship, which is, you'll know from, you know, the USS Excelsior, which we think we last see Captain Sulu being in charge of, except this time we now have an Excelsior as the Enterprise. The A is officially retired. It's gone. It's been years since these three have been out. And this is where we get, honestly, kind of a false theme for the movie coming through.
Yeah.
Where the reason why these three are on board in the first place is simply as part of a ceremony to have the B leave dry dock and go out into space for its maiden little voyage of literally jumping to the Kepler belt and then hopping right back to dry dock Earth. Yeah. So this is just very much pageantry to have these three aboard. And we have this idea that this movie is going to be about passing the torch from one generation to the next, which I believe is also, I think, maybe what it was marketed as, is that's kind of what we're expecting out of this. And then, of course, we do meet the captain of this new ship, which when you see him, you may start to think, is this his ship? Or did Matthew Broderick convince him to steal his dad's ship and take it out for the day?
Yes. Good old Alan Ruck. Yep. That's hilarious.
Yeah. And part of the hilarity that does happen with the ship is as it goes out, we do quickly develop into the main plot of the movie, where we have the two ships in trouble as there's this unknown wave moving through space, causing all sorts of crazy going on, and there is no one around except for the Enterprise to help it. The only problem is that there's nothing arriving of any use to the Enterprise until Tuesday, when it actually is going to be done with all the dry dock stuff.
See, sorry, for the folks that don't watch the video version of this, I was dancing like a wacky inflatable tube man that you'll see at a used car salesmanship, because that's what this wave, this ribbon looks like. It's like doing a worm in space, and and so I got to say right away, kind of takes me out of it a little. Now, this had Industrial Light and Magic backing, as well as special effects folks that actually worked on TNG. So the right people were in place to deliver this stuff. But right away, the energy ribbon to me has this kind of cartoony appearance, right? Like if you had like an ominous like black hole butthole type of scenario where you just can't really tell what that is, but it's like, okay, that kind of looks like an olive. It's like, that scares me a lot more than this worm out there, just like a centipede, getting the party on in space, it's
despite Mark's description of the wacky flailing inflatable arm man version of this wave, they do kind of make it show that like it destroys a ship that's caught in the wave, that this is something that we are supposed to be afraid of, despite the fact that it looks like a first grader's attempt at trying to draw an Asian dragon going through space. But we have the old crew who quickly comes to save the day, but it does end with the apparent death of Captain James T. Kirk.
And before that happens, there's this like big rescue mission that kind of kicks into effect. It's like it's an attempt at like Kobayashi Maru in person live type of thing, right? Like we're revisiting that. And what I really want to once again do a hat tip to here was the original crew reacting to Kirk. You can see Kirk as he's like getting up in his chair, and he's looking up every time there's a decision to be made. He like stands up, and like the rest of the crew is like, "Hey, whoa, it's all right, he's got this."
But Scotty's comment of, "Captain, is there something wrong with your chair?"
Yeah. And I gotta say though, as bad as some of the acting can be across the Star Trek universe, these little subtle nods and the fact that like Chekhov and Scotty are both paying attention to Kirk, and they're kind of going, "Oh yeah, look at him, he's right back in it."
Oh yeah,
like
this is where he wants to be.
You can tell it's where all of us are probably going to be at some point in our lives, where we're like, man, I remember when I could do that. It's like the Magnificent Seven has this scene where it's like there's the fastest gun handler in the West, and there's like 3 flies on the table, and this guy's watching him. He reaches out and he grabs 2 of them, and he opens his hand and they fly out, and this guy goes, "Man, that's impressive." And he goes, "There was a time when I could catch all 3." Like that's kind of what this is doing right now. Like you're seeing this, there's still fight in this dog, right? And I before we get away from it, I thought, as ridiculous as Shatner acting can be, it watching it now, it hits a lot harder than it did in '94.
He reeled it in for this, where like obviously like I think Shatnering is definitely kind of a thing in terms of overacting. Like when you think of like overacting in science fiction, there is William Shatner, and despite all the little Whovians will be very mad at me, there is David Tennant through his first 2 seasons of Doctor Who. That is all overacting, but that's what you kind of get throughout the series with him, and he does tame that quite a bit in this movie.
Yeah, Joe, whoever spoke to Shatner before this movie and said, "Can you not be yourself?" It's like going to Nicolas Cage and being like, "Can you just read this script for a minute?" And not like you. Like, just read it like a normal person.
And then they start the whole script. I don't read the script. Script reads me like stuff. Yeah. But Shatner really, like, it's kind of interesting the way he does it though, because it feels like there are times where he wants to do it because Kirk wants to be his young self.
Yes.
But then he quickly realizes that's not me anymore. I can't and should not do these things.
Yes.
And therefore we see that through his acting.
Which I think is why it hits me so much harder now, being a man in my mid-30s, is that you're seeing almost an image of what life is going to be like someday for you. You know, you're seeing that. And so that's why for me, I thought when you get to see Kirk kind of going through the ship and helping with this situation and all that, and then unfortunately, potentially deceased, it was rough. It was rough to kind of go through, and I don't mean like in a bad way. It was rough to kind of go. You feel like you're right back in the saddle.
Oh yeah.
Tragedy potentially strikes, and then suddenly run a boat, like not a spaceship, an actual boat in the water.
In classic TNG hilarity, what would a TNG movie or episode be without some holodeck shenanigans? And so we see his boat on the water, and it is, rightfully so, the Enterprise, the HMS Enterprise, Her Majesty's ship, hanging out there. And we, of course, see most of the Next Gen crew in, like, officers' uniforms. And it turns out Worf had been arrested. But it wasn't real arrest.
I still don't understand this sequence. So, like, they pull him out of the brig. He's got chains on. I mean, it's literally like Amistad style. Like, he's chained up. He's down there. But then they give him a promotion?
Yeah.
Was that confusing to you, too, or was that just me?
A little bit. And the way I kind of, like, worked it out in my head is the fact that, Worf kind of always gets shit on in the Next Generation. So, like, he's always supposed to be this rough and tough warrior, but he's always the first one, like, knocked out. And that's, I know, like, from a writing standpoint, it's meant to show that, hey, this thing's, like, whatever's out there is not to be trifled with because it just took out a Klingon pretty easily. So it seems like Worf is not fully sure of what's going on, and he's just is kind of going along with it. And then it turns out they're actually promoting him. So they were playing a gag on a friend and actually giving him something good.
It was such a weird, especially back then, like back when I wasn't like all big on what TNG was fully capable of. But then you throw that out there. It was very bizarre. Like I get what they were trying to do. It's you just saw the OG crew, and now you're seeing what could potentially be an even OGer crew because they're on a freaking boat in what looks like the golden age of piracy.
But I mean, that does get quickly interrupted. But first, we do have Data not understanding human humor once again and throws Dr. Crusher into the cold water. And then Picard makes a timely comment over how nice it would have been to be on the old ship because no one was able to bother you or reach you because he had just gotten a call from Starfleet. And it turned out was something bad. But before we get to that badness, it would set off a very brooding Picard for the rest of this movie, I would like to analyze that statement over like how nice it would have been to be on this ship and to be true explorers and how great it would have been. This is a statement from like someone who thinks they'd like to like go off the grid until they would actually have to go off the grid. And then you realize how much off the grid sucks.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Now, you went a different direction than I was going to go because the first thing I was going to talk about was I thought the uniforms stayed on the holodeck, but it turns out they were wearing real outfits.
The whole time.
those like English officer uniforms. We just had there's a deck on the Enterprise that it's just full of costumes that we wear on the holodeck.
Well, I mean, from what we've seen in like the Next Generation series, like obviously you have replicators, so they just make what you need, and they do have a record of what trends and styles were through multiple cultures and multiple timelines, because there are plenty of times in the series where we do see them like interacting with people who they're not supposed to interact with, but they pretend to be whatever. But so we're assuming that whenever they're done with these clothes, like, I want to know, where do they go? Do they just incinerate them? Do they feed them back into something that resequences them? Or is Picard like, no, I've formed a memory with this, and now he has a very large closet with all of his holodeck stuff?
That's what I was saying. Like, you get the Robin Hood outfit in there too, and he's just keeping all this stuff. That took me a little by surprise, because I'm like going, it's not like you could go back on the bridge wearing that. Like, what? Come on, seriously? Like, take a minute. Go to your room, change out of that stuff. But nope, they're just there. Full on costumes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was hilarious.
On top of a Picard crisis that happens, there's also another crisis in that our energy ribbon has been spotted once again through space. And the Enterprise, this time the D, must go into battle to save the day.
The D must go into what now?
Oh, the D has to go where?
Yeah, you just made that one. Sorry, dick jokes. They still exist.
We're not above that. So it goes in to take care of the Nexus issue, but Picard basically absent through most of it, and is kind of like skirting and shoving off responsibilities onto Riker throughout this little sequence here. And the reason why, as we come to find out, is he'd received news that his nephew had died in a fire. And like typical like English Picard fashion, he decides to just compartmentalize it by saying, these things happen, and I'm just going to deal with it and be an officer.
Well, he tries to say these things happen, but then he's got some time alone with the ship counselor, as he tends to, and dude starts melting, man. Like, I actually wanted to give Patrick Stewart not just general praise, because not every single episode of TNG was his best work.
No. When you're on for 7 seasons and they're like 22 episodes a season, you can't. You can't have not every episode can be a winner. Yeah, but this sequence where him and Troy are talking about, the legacy of the Picards, and how he didn't have kids because he thought the legacy was guaranteed, or at least the family tree would keep growing, right? Yes. The name would live on. But now he finds out, no, it's not. It's not. This is the last of the lineage just gone out. And here is where the true theme of the movie has been revealed. It's not about passing the torch. It's about the end, Mark. And that's what this movie is trying to tell us, is that everything has an end. It is inescapable. And it does come for us all. And what we ultimately see is, like, specifically the captains of the two Enterprises dealing with this. We have some other things happen where we kind of see people deal with like a finality. Like Data has an activated emotion chip, and he experiences fear for the first time, so he cowers, fearing for his life, which he's never done before. But it is primarily all about Picard dealing with his finite nature. I believe at one point he says that he's now reached the part of his life where the days ahead of him are now shorter than the days that were behind, or fewer than the days that were behind. And he is struggling and dealing with this.
And that stuff hits hard, not because of, once again, age or midlife crises, as we've talked on this show before, but it's this idea that gets revisited across Star Trek several times, because even in the rebooted universe, Kirk in this universe, he's not nearly as old as these guys are.
No.
But he's already kind of having these like finality kinds of discussions about stuff. Same thing happens in the original film series with the OG crew. You have that same type of progression, like this is going to end at some point. And so for me, that's when I revisited this throughout the years, I think I began to appreciate this a lot more.
Yeah.
Now, Joe, you and I have talked about this before. There needs to be a book for people who are 25 years and older called The Things They Don't Tell Us. And you could put in that book, financial advice, tax advice, marriage advice, whatever. I would put in there's like a chapter called "You Always Think You're Going to Have More Time."
Yeah.
And this is hitting me harder than it should have for a Star Trek movie because of that fact. The amount of time we have, yes, is finite. And whenever you go into a time traveling type of film, I think a lot of people get stuck in the mechanics of how that works. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, here we just have the energy ribbon, doing its thing, right?
Yeah, good old Nexus. Yeah, it's the not the nexus of the universe like on the corner of First and First in a telephone booth, but it's a nexus of time itself, in that this is how the movie chooses to deal with this whole ending of a story.
Well, it's what I think is important about this is that sci-fi has a lot of bad explanations. Mm-hmm. There's even a lot of gobbledygook, and here I am sounding like an old person even using that word. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of technobabble and jargon throughout this movie, but it's usually not applied towards the actual nexus and or the ribbon itself. And for me, I'm like, you know what? This is important to draw people in. Don't overcomplicate this stuff. No. This ribbon is unique to the movie. It's so at least we kind of have that going for us. Yeah. But something really cool about it is how much it ties into Guinan's story, or Guinan's. I always forget Guinan. I always forget Guinan's name. So Guinan, aka Whoopi Goldberg, her character on the show was like this constant question mark. Mm-hmm. Where is she from? What does she know? And it turns out she knows some shit about this ribbon.
She knows a lot about all the things, but especially this Nexus ribbon, because what we saw earlier in the movie is she and a man who, for some reason, and a younger version of myself, always confused with Sting, Malcolm McDowell, came out of the Nexus ribbon in space when Kirk had helped save these two other ships. So now, suddenly, Guinan has had her time on the D, and Malcolm McDowell's character has been trying to get back to the Nexus his whole life.
Yeah, that's funny that you just made that connection, because now all I can hear is Malcolm McDowell as Sting. I'll be watching you.
Oh my God.
Good Lord.
He's just jamming out to the Tarzan soundtrack somewhere now.
I gotta say, Malcolm McDowell, obviously, he's a very well-known actor, very well known for portraying bad guys, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what this Dr. Soren, yes. Soren. Dr. Soren is very much singularly motivated. You don't have to spend a ton of time there. We know that he's clearly up to no good. You can tell it right away the first time you see him, mostly because the first time you see him is technically... Well, no. The first time you see him, he's already got like blood all over his face, which I'm assuming isn't his own, but it might
Probably
be. Who
not.
knows? Yeah, he just looks guilty, okay?
He does. Very guilty looking. And British, so therefore probably
evil.
Bad in our cinema. Mm-hmm.
He's either evil or possibly ancient Rome, because we all know that ancient Romans were all British. So.
I mean, really, the entire Mediterranean was British. So,
once again, the stuff they didn't teach us in Western Civ, everyone in the Mediterranean, British. But yeah, the Nexus mystery, I think, was actually fun at first, because once again, we're not resting on any like crazy time travel mechanics or anything all that deep to really get into here. It's pretty much this: you touch the ribbon just kind of consumes you,
sucks you up.
Yeah, and then you enter a space that's devoid of being, basically held to any time continuum rules.
Yeah,
you're just in stasis. You're in purgatory, essentially.
And that's what I think is fascinating about this movie, is that it does something earlier than other movies and other TV shows have done, who have been praised for doing the same thing. And the Nexus is this movie's commentary on death. It is, from what Guinan describes as pure joy. It is basically you revisiting either a moment in your life that you were very, very fond of or brought you basically bliss, and you stay within that moment for the rest of eternity. Or it could be something you've always wanted that you now get as you're stuck there inside the Nexus. But stuck, I mean, sheerly threatening people with a good time.
Yeah.
But, I mean, this is something that we've seen in Supernatural, because this is how heaven works in Supernatural. You are initially, like, initial heaven in Supernatural is you being in your favorite moment of your life. There's also a fantastic Japanese film called, what is it called? Dang it. Oh, it's killing me. It'll come to me after the recording is done, and I'll have it in the notes. But basically, it's the same thing. It is people who are in the afterlife trying to decide how they're going to spend the rest of eternity. And so they look through a lot of their memories, trying to decide what they want to stay in. And ultimately, they tend to stay in the after portion. So instead of the big moment itself, it's the moment of comfort you have after it, and that bliss that you have that they choose to stay in. And this is Star Trek doing it before either of those two things, and questioning what we would want eternity to look like and how we'd want to spend it. And if even that happiest moment and us getting that thing we've always wanted would actually be enough for some people.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, I mean, that's clearly what Dr. Soren is trying to get back to. He was there at one point. He's faced some tragedy in his life, and at the hands of the Borg, which, for those of you who have watched Star Trek, the Borg are pretty much the end game of everything.
Indeed.
So it was interesting to tie that together a little bit, but to see what the Nexus truly was. Now, this might be where some people want to dock a few points, because it's unexplained as to why the Nexus behaves as it does. Mm-hmm. But what I don't really get is that everybody figures out it's fake, like, immediately.
Yeah.
So this, like you mentioned, there's this euphoria and this feeling of, oh, this is one of the best experiences of my life. But then you realize it's fake. It's like, well, how long would that person stay sane in the Nexus unless it reloads a checkpoint every night? Right, along with your memories.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of brings in that whole idea over, like, what is real anyway, sort of thing. Like, you can feel everything there, you can smell it there, all the senses are there, and isn't that real enough? And that's where, like, Soren, to him, clearly, yes, he would much rather live in that lie, knowing that it's a lie, but it's a happy lie. Kind of like how Cypher in The Matrix ultimately wants to just be plugged back in after seeing what actual reality is like. He would much rather be in the program.
And I am absolutely thrilled you made that reference, because that's exactly what I was thinking at the same time. And it does explain Soren's obsession with it and why he'd be willing to do these incredibly dark things to get back into the Nexus, because it's not like you just wait and you order it through Uber and it shows up and you step in, right? Like, doesn't work that way. You have to be uniquely positioned to be able to get into the Nexus. And what Soren figures out is that, hey, I just have to kill a few stars and billions of people, and I can get back in there.
Yeah. The gravity will pull the Nexus, or lack of gravity will change the direction of the Nexus and where it's moving, and I should be able to get sucked right in. It'll be great. That sweet, sweet Nexus life.
And that's one of those things about this movie that some sci-fi films will overlook, is really the body count. Like that,
lots of people die.
I was going to say, for one person to be this evil, you would think that laws would be made against obtaining all the stuff that, well, I guess to a point, he is illegally obtaining all the weaponry used to do this. So I guess the laws are in place.
The Romulans are like, this guy's crossing a line. We never see a single Romulan in this movie, but we did find out they did come after Soren, kind of in the early bits. We just don't see them there.
Not alive. Not alive. We do see one on the floor of where they find him. But yes, you are correct. Like, you can, like, I don't think they made a big enough case for how big the stakes were. Like, how even the people that are helping him realized, right? And it still, though, evil is evil. We've got that down. I think they did a decent enough job with building that. But the part of this that even I took some issues with initially was how long we get to spend with the captains, with Picard, with Kirk, because clearly this is their movie, right?
Oh yeah.
This is about their journeys and how similar things maybe were at this point in time in their lives. So the parallels should be pretty strong, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, but you kind of find out that no, they're not. These guys are actually at a critical like juncture in their lives, but they're not reacting the same way.
Yeah.
That's what I actually thought was a good move here, was to have Kirk, even though he feels the call, right? He still does appreciate what he has outside of Starfleet, despite making the fateful return to go back and all that good stuff. But
yes,
but they're very critically different. I mean, what did you think about these guys at this age of their lives?
See, this is where like I wonder if people think too much about the movie and lose the point of the movie in that idea and that pursuit of explanation of things. Because what the movie is trying to do is looking at how two very different captains are dealing with the end of their lives. You have Kirk, who kind of what we learned through the movie, regrets just how much time starts to regret how much time he focused on his career in Starfleet and therefore missed out on love and other parts of his life. But then while he is in the Nexus and he's pursuing the idea of I will finally have the love that I always wanted, he does do something that he does an event that he remembers scaring him every single time he did it in real life.
Yeah.
But was in the Nexus, wasn't afraid of it. And when that fear was gone, that the thrill that was James T. Kirk is gone in itself.
Yeah.
So he then realizes, I need to get out of here and I need to make things right. So then you have Picard, who his experience of the Nexus is like a very odd Victorian Hans Christian Andersen fantasy of him having a loving family going, well, hello, Father. Thank you for the Christmas gifts. We enjoyed it very much. Dinner is ready. We shall go have a nice boiled goose at this time.
Hello, Dad. Could you help me with my puzzle, please?
And as
Why,
much
yes,
as
Alan
Picard,
Rickman, son. Let's go.
as much as Picard really does enjoy now having this legacy, because that's what Picard is worried about, is this legacy that needs to be left behind, that the lineage of the Picard name, despite having all these great accomplishments, is going to end with him and his brother, who are now both too old to have any children of their own. So he even at this point says, you know what? That doesn't matter if so much else gets sacrificed to make this work. So we have both captains return to the fold and get out of the Nexus, which also, by the way, a very nice space-time continuum disruption, because it'll just let you leave when you want to leave.
Yeah.
And because all the reality exists at the same time within the Nexus, you can just pop out whenever you feel like it, and you're there where you need to be. So I can see how some people basically construe that as that's a very easy plot development. It's in still my opinion, better than, the car's a nuclear reactor because it needs to be. Not a day will go by where we do not make fun of that terrible movie. But I digress.
Yes,
we have the two captains come out to inevitably save the day, which does bring us to a very damning point in this movie for many fans, and that is we do see the death of James T. Kirk in his attempt to save the day.
Now, this is where I think maybe people are unfair for why they hate this movie. They hear Kirk dies and they get pissed.
Yeah.
Like they hear Kirk dies and it's like, that just sucks.
Mm-hmm.
I was one of those people. It wasn't nearly as big as like when you saw Optimus Prime die for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
But sorry, I know some wounds never heal.
Always stings.
This was one of those times where I was actually at peace with a major character's death.
Mm-hmm.
And he dies in the most Kirk way possible.
Oh, yeah.
Which is just, oh my. and then that twinkle leaves his eyes and he's gone.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's actually not the worst way to send him out, because he's seen so many things in his life and he's experienced so much that when death is what causes him to say, oh my, because that's what the universe used to do. Him seeing these grand images and all this stuff, that's what made him do that.
Yeah.
So for me, when I saw that the first time, I didn't get it for that reason. I got that as an adult, of course, not as a teenager. But that's what eventually ended up being what I thought about that sequence, is that it's like, yeah, he gets to show that he's still got it, just like Tyson, in The Hangover. But his death scene is actually really well done, I think, for a flagship character in a property like this. I don't know. What do you think?
I agree completely. And even looking at what leads up to it, you do have this very heroic Kirk doing heroic action sort of things. He is clearly the better fisticuffer than Soren when they do that, which this is the second of the 2 fisticuff scenes of the movie where we see Kirk go out. Although, is a shame we didn't see the flying crossbody Kirk move in this fight.
I know.
Where he just jumps to the side and just bodies the guy. Like, missed opportunity. But, oh well, he didn't get to do it one last time. But at the same time, when it comes to a character death, a beloved character death, I thought it handled it well. Again, we can clearly see that the Trekkies and Trekkers of the time, not convinced, and even Shatner himself would eventually not be convinced, because this does spawn an entire Elseworlds book series of, it turned out Kirk didn't actually die. And we have this whole, like, gallivanting, like, adventures of Kirk in the Next Generation era, where he is again the captain of a different thing. The Shatnerverse was born because of this movie, where Shatner could just, and he, by the way, he narrates all those books.
Yeah, he does.
The audio ones. So please do look into it. It's a fun time.
You just imagine him after the movie comes out, and then he's like writing that book, and he goes, "That's not the way it happened." Because I do think that even the Shatnerverse stuff, some people don't even know it exists.
No.
And when I look back at this film, obviously my brothers and I have joked with the Shatnerverse for many years. But when I look back at this film, there's a couple things that I actually look forward to, and there's a few things that I don't look forward to. And you may or may not agree with this, but I'll list them off. I don't agree with the idea of underutilizing the TNG crew. Now, I get that this is about the 2 captains, right, and figuring out their lives. But you really just relegate the entire rest of the cast of TNG to they're not even one-liners. They're just half-assed scenes. I mean, one of the parts of that I wanted to point out specifically is Data's emotional chip.
Oh yeah.
And it is hard to watch those scenes. It was hard to watch him, and I get it. He's an android trying to learn how to be a human. Like, I get it. It's going to be awkward. It should be. It's awkward to the point where it's almost unwatchable.
Well, it's kind of like how, like, we've complained about how, like, a Thor: Love and Thunder is just one joke after the next, and therefore it's hard to take the movie seriously. That's sadly kind of what happens to Data in this movie. While they will pepper in, like, some heartfelt moments with Data, where he even at one point asks to be deactivated because he cannot handle the influx of emotion anymore. So here, even, like, again, we talk about, like, death being the predominant theme of this movie, and Data actually begging for it because he actually turns out can't handle being human and dealing with everything. But, when he's turning a tricorder into a puppet, and he's, like, turning everything into a joke at any given moment, and he's making songs out of scanning for life forms, it does grow old very quickly.
That is audible pain, by the way. Because you're right, there is a high end to this performance, and then the majority of it is this low end that you're just almost embarrassed that they wanted to do, right? So that's definitely one part of it. Now, the other side of this that I actually rather enjoyed about this are some of the things I mentioned before, is how well they nailed how the OG crew reacts to Kirk, and how they meet Sulu's daughter, and how there's these realizations that do reference the themes later on, like Picard's lack of having children of his own, and the same thing goes for Kirk. So, like, seeing that kind of stuff, I thought that was really well done, and they didn't waste, like, the OG crew's chance in that early portion to make an impact for the rest of the movie, right?
Yes.
So that's why I thought, since you started off that well, and you still give time to the original three characters. That's why I thought the TNG stuff really just didn't do enough. Except for when at the end when Riker tells Picard that he's going to live forever. I was like, that is such a Riker line. Such a Riker. Oh.
Classic Riker. And
Yeah.
I believe at one point, even like early in the movie, back on the holodeck, when we're on the HMS Enterprise, and Picard is pining for the days of being at sea, and Riker's immediate gripe against it is there weren't any women.
Yes.
Classic Riker. Like, Frakes does find ways to make his character shine in the little that we do get to experience him here.
That's why I loved it. I always loved it how Riker got to step in on the TV show and manage, because they are different styles. Picard's got this dignified, my posture is perfect. Meanwhile, Riker's like, hey guys, let's wrap this up and get a few beers after we're done, kind of mentality. Like he's a man's man, in a good sense, not the I'm not going to go that route, but in a good sense. Like he's actually really good at this the charisma side of things.
Yeah.
So once again, calling back to the cinematography, the scene where you do see the captain's chair when the Enterprise is all detached because the ship has to detach. It's a movie. That was really hard hitting.
Yeah.
For me, even as a teenager, this is one of those elements that I appreciated for the last 30 years, is seeing that chair intact, and then them kind of reflecting on it, right? Where after all the things Picard has been through, he still kind of maintains that, hey, it's a chair.
It's a chair. Yeah, that's the thing. He has no doubt that this will not be the last ship named Enterprise, which brings us to the lasting legacy of this movie. We mentioned that the Shatnerverse is a thing that spawned off because of this, and that's its own thing. But we also talked about how like a lot of people hated it. But what did we think about it? Specifically, Mark, what did you think about this movie?
I personally think this movie is just as weird as the Nexus's movements itself. This rubber banding effect, right? This movie will not continue to keep your enthusiasm in every scene. It just won't. For one, if you're a big fan of Star Trek, I think you can get through this and still appreciate it for what it is. If you are a casual fan and you've never really watched a whole lot of Star Trek, I know that's a weird thing to say, but when you're putting major motion pictures out there and you want to gather as much of an audience as you can, this isn't the kind of movie that was ever going to be able to achieve that. So for me, that's what it is. It's a peaks and valley movie that consistently switches between both. It's not like a John Wick movie where it's like, 110 miles an hour for almost like 40 minutes and then we get a little dip. It's like, no. This movie continues to do that up and down. So I can appreciate some of these individual moments, others not so much. But for me, this is one of those movies where I do think, D's still get degrees. And just because it's a D doesn't mean that you can't appreciate a ton of things going on in this movie. But it is a mid-ground type of exchange, Joe. The critics and the fans agree for a reason. And I actually stand behind the sentiment. What about you?
I would agree. I wouldn't give it a D. I'd go with a solid C on this one. I mean, I didn't hate it. Just because what it feels like to me is how, like we talked about, how like Star Trek Beyond felt like a 2-part episode of the original series.
Yeah.
This feels like a 2-part episode of Next Generation, but season 7. Which, if you recall season 7, I mean, you've got Crusher fucking a ghost, and you've got a bunch of weird things in there trying to give like these larger explanations of humanity and why we are the way we are and what we hope to be. And it basically feels like that. This is a continuation of season 7 Star Trek Next Generation, which is very much like showing like the age of the show. And where it sucks is that like what it does well, it does very well, but what it does poorly, it also does very poorly. So it really brings things down. So there are things I appreciate more being an older audience watching it now, for someone who's like the idea of me dying is like my single largest anxiety in life. And so when you see the captains transition from how they felt about it at the start of the movie to how they are at the end, these are things that help me deal with my own anxiety. But there's enough in the movie that will detract you from that theme, where it's a missed opportunity where you could have had other cast members also experiencing this idea of the nexus and the opportunity that it holds and what it could mean for them, and have these other aspects of dying there as opposed to just what the two, main characters felt.
Which I do think the nexus as a concept is a worthy one to present, and because that's probably the one that requires the least amount of familiarity with this property to kind of get into, right? Yeah. I thought the nexus was a good idea. I thought that the narrative of this man out of time in more ways than one scenario was good, but it lacks the severity and, frankly, the marketing campaign that a movie of today's kind of blockbuster standards would have.
Yeah.
If this kind of storyline came out today and you tighten a little bit of it, I think this is a blockbuster film. And for a Star Trek movie, this still didn't do poorly. They had to cut the budget a ton, and they made like 3 times their money back. So
there's that. I mean, C's get degrees. And on that note, I think this is the time where we would like to thank you for listening to Digital Dissection, as we always appreciate everything the Dissection crew does for us week after week.
Your support goes a long way, and if you happen upon this show by accident, why not drop us a review or comment on the show?
We also like hearing from you, so feel free to message us over at digitaldissectionpodcast@gmail.com. The Dissectors welcome your ideas for future shows, and, well, anything that's done tastefully. And this is where we'd normally leave you with the tagline for our show, but instead, I think I had to leave you with some of Picard's final words from this movie, as this is where the movie does truly shine. Someone once told me that time was a predator that stalked us all our lives. But I rather believe that time is a companion who goes with us on our journey and reminds us to cherish every moment, because they'll never come again. What we leave behind is not as important as how we lived. After all, number one, we're only mortal.